Ladies and gentlemen, very good evening to all of you. Welcome to the third session today of StrategyEdge 2020. As every day, we have a fantastic speaker and someone very eminent representing the Indian perspective as well. So we have Professor Jaideep Prabhu, who's the Professor of Marketing, Judge Business School, University of Cambridge. The theme of the session, as you're aware, is fostering a culture of innovation, the role of leadership. We also have Mr. Shivakumar, who's the Group Executive President, Corporate Strategy and Business Development of the Aditya Birla Group. I would now request Mr. Shivakumar to please take over.
Yeah, so welcome everyone. Wonderful that you could join this session. We have Professor Jaideep Prabhu, who is the Professor of Marketing at the Judge Business School, University of Cambridge. He is an authority on innovation. He's written about frugal innovation, jugaad innovation, business growth, doing more with less, etc. He's regularly on media. You see him in all the big magazines, newspapers, as well as television channels. And what he'll cover for us today is some of the things and questions that you typically have in your mind, which is what is innovation? What is a big innovation vis-a-vis a small innovation? What is the process to follow to generate innovation? Who owns innovation in a company? How much investment is required to drive innovation? And what capabilities are needed to drive innovation? So that's what he's going to cover for us today. I will this book in IIT Delhi in 2015 when he and Naviraj did the Jugaad Innovation book. So over to you, Professor, all yours.
Thank you, Mr. Shivakumar. It's really a great pleasure to be with you today and with all of you indeed for this wonderful series organized by the CII. I really appreciate you taking the time, all of you, to be here. And now I'd like to begin my presentation. I'm going to share my slides. I hope you can all see and hear me. And I want to talk to you today about how to foster a culture of innovation in your organization and the role that you as leaders play in fostering such a culture of innovation. So, what I want to talk about, as Mr. Shivakumar was saying, is let's talk quickly about what is innovation. We'll look at some examples. We'll contrast innovation in more affluent societies with emerging markets. Then I want to get into some of the challenges that organizations face when they innovate. Everybody wants to innovate, but not everybody is able to do that. And interestingly, some of the most successful organizations, after having become successful through innovation, struggle to do it again and again. So why is that the case? And how can you solve that problem by creating a culture of innovation? How can you embed some attitudes and practices deep in the organization to help you innovate again and again over a long period of time? And I'll end with some thoughts on your role as leaders, what you can do to foster such a culture of innovation in your organizations. So what is innovation? Here's a great definition from Joseph Schumpeter, one of the leading economists of the last century, who wrote a lot about innovation and its role in the economy. For Schumpeter, it was the successful commercial exploitation of new ideas. So it's not just new ideas for the sake of new ideas, that would be invention, but it's the commercial exploitation. And he said that there were several ways you could do this. One is you introduce new products or services. This offers some new benefits, ideally, to consumers, and they therefore are willing to pay extra sometimes, a margin. It gets you growth, it gets you revenues. Another way to exploit new ideas is to adopt new processes, to do more process innovation in how you manufacture products or how you deliver services, how you do your back office work. And that can give you efficiencies, it can reduce costs, it can reduce waste and time, and that's how you can get a competitive advantage. And a third approach is where you combine the two. You actually at the same time have a new offering to the market as well as a new process of offering it. And that is an entirely new business model. So let's look at some examples, some very well-known ones. The iPod, when it came out, was a wonderful new product service that offered many benefits to people, new ways for them to buy and record and listen to music, store music, and so on. And when this was introduced by Apple, it had a dramatic impact on Apple's fortunes. You can see here the stock price of Apple tripled in the year that the iPod iTunes was introduced. And it overtook much larger companies like Sony that had many more patents, that invested much more in R&D, that had many more products. And interestingly, Sony could have introduced their equivalent of the iPod and iTunes. They had MP3 technology, they had music assets, they had done it before, but they had brands like Discman, Walkman. And so they could have done it, but didn't do it, and you see the effects. And we'll come back to that question again. Why didn't Sony do it? Now, process innovation. This is where digital can have a big impact when you move your operations from a kind of manual platform to an electronic platform, as L&T did. Moving to an electronic platform can facilitate knowledge sharing internally as well as with external partners. This can result in efficiencies, reducing a costly paper trail, and reducing waste of time. And so you can deliver on time, and time is money. So that's an example of process innovation. A business model innovation, this is Flipkart or Amazon, where at the same time, they introduced a new offering to customers, a new way to buy books and CDs and music and all this stuff. But equally, they did it in a new way. They delivered it in a new way. There was a new operating model. And as a result, at the same time, they were able to generate new revenues like a product innovation would, while dramatically reducing their costs like a process innovation would. And when a company introduces a business model change that is holistic like this, it is very difficult for others to immediately copy them because they may have to change large parts of their own business model. Now, I have spent a lot of my time, my career studying innovation. In the first part of my career, I studied innovation in developed countries. And then I became interested in innovation in emerging economies like India, where I grew up. And when I started to look at innovation in India, I was struck by how the approach was different. And one would argue that it actually should be different. So one is, I was struck by how frugal the approach was relative to Western corporates and how affordable the products were. The emphasis was very much on affordability. Also, where Western corporates can be very structured in their approach, Indian companies, and this is true in many other emerging markets like China too, there's a lot of flexibility. They are able to respond very quickly to very dramatically changing circumstances and uncertainty. And a lot of the solutions seem designed to be inclusive, to bring people who are outside the formal economy into the formal economy. Let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about by contrast. So here, this is a product for an affluent society. This is a high-end fridge. It'll talk to you and you can talk back to it through this tablet PC. And for that pleasure, you pay about $3,000. Now, it's a bit of a caricature, but you often see this with big companies. They have long-term projects, big budgets. They work on technology sometimes for the sake of it. They come up with some new technology. They put it into their products, differentiate them. And then because the process is expensive, they charge customers for it. Now, you may see something like this in India, of course, but you're equally likely to see something like this. So the expensive fridge is $3,000. This clay fridge, Mitti Cool, is $30. And in many ways, it exemplifies this frugal, flexible, inclusive approach. This is Mansukh Bhai, the person behind the clay fridge. He comes from a village in Gujarat. In 2001, there was a very serious earthquake. In response to that, many people lost their household possessions, including the matkas. And he got the inspiration for a clay fridge from broken matkas. He thought, okay, I could reshape the matka, make it like a box, very frugal. A lot of flexibility there and inclusive, designed for people like himself who'd like to have a fridge, might not be able to afford one, may not have access to electricity. This is the next best thing. Here's another example. So this is an incubator, beautiful machine from a company like GE, but it's about $25,000. And at that price, it's beyond many parts of India, particularly rural India or people in other rural areas. The clinics will not be able to afford these devices. Even if you give it to them for free, they may not have access to technicians or electricity. In a situation like that, something like this is very powerful. This is, of course, not an incubator. It doesn't have an oxygen tent. It's a baby warmer, but it's designed to address a large part of the problem that the incubator is solving, a problem of infant mortality, where, if an infant is born 1 or 2 weeks prematurely, they cannot maintain their body temperature. This baby warmer will save them. And interestingly, the warmer was not developed by a large company. It was developed by 4 former students from Stanford who had taken a course called Design for Extreme Affordability. where the objective of the course was to come up with a working prototype that's 1/100th the cost of the existing solution. And the students could take any problem. They took this problem of infant mortality. They came up with this baby warmer. After they graduated, they went on to test it with mothers and midwives in rural India. They got venture capital backing. They tested in the medical hospital, and then they were ready to commercialize it when they hit a wall. They didn't have a sales force to take it to rural clinics. So at that point, they partnered with GE Healthcare, and GE's sales force actually helped commercialize it. So my co-authors and I, we ended up talking to scores of such innovators in India and in other countries. And when we asked them how they would describe this frugal, flexible, inclusive approach, they would often use the word jugaad. And this is the book that Mr. Shivakumar was referring to. We wrote this book, as a homage to this approach and to really understand how it was done. And we define this as the art of overcoming harsh constraints by improvising an effective solution, not a perfect solution, but a good enough solution, and importantly, one that uses limited resources that are available in that context. And after this book was published, interestingly, people from other parts of the world wrote to tell us, oh, we have something similar in our country. So Brazilians, for instance, said they have two words like jugaad to describe a similar kind of approach. And you see this not only in other emerging markets, but also in the West. And I'll talk about that in a second. So in the jugaad book, what we did was we looked at scores of examples, not only from India, but from other emerging markets in Asia and Latin America and Africa. And we tried to extract some principles. And these are the 6 principles that we identified. These innovators are very good at identifying opportunities in adverse circumstances. In fact, necessity is the mother of invention. Second, they are, of course, very good at doing more with less. They look for resources they have and use them to substitute for resources they don't have. And this involves a lot of flexible thinking. So the idea is if you cannot climb the mountain, try and find a way around it. The solutions are often very simple, which helps not only with economizing, but also helps with the use and maintenance and adoption of these products. Often they include marginal people as not only consumers, but also part of the solution. And they're very passionate about what they're doing, and they have to be because they have to persist against the odds. Now, Mr. Shivakumar will recognize this. It's not just grassroots innovators that do this. Large multinationals have done this very successfully. Nokia for years dominated emerging markets on the back of these kinds of very suited and highly affordable, robust devices like this one, inspired by people in urban slums like in Dharvi and so on. And when this came out, this was before the iPod, the world's best-selling consumer electronics device. And of course, now we know that mobile phones are, the world is awash with mobile phones. Everybody in, even in remote areas has access to one. And once you have that as a resource, you can introduce other innovations, service innovations, like M-Pesa, for instance, which was introduced by Vodafone in Kenya in 2007, which allows a lady like this from a village in Kenya to call her son using her basic text-enabled phone. She can call her son who's in Nairobi in the city earning a wage, and she can not only talk to him, but ask him to send money phone. He can text this to her onto her phone, and she can then cash it in the neighboring corner shop, in the Kirana shop, which is an M-Pesa agent. So this is financial inclusion for people who are outside the banking system. Now there are something like 25 million people in Kenya alone who have access to this. And now, even if they don't have bank accounts, they can make micropayments and they can afford things which are also, might have involve a capital expenditure, such as solar lighting kits. So this kit, for instance, can be installed in a hut in rural Kenya. The person who in the house may not be able to afford the upfront cost. They may not have that kind of liquidity. They may not have a bank account to take a loan, but they're able to pay as you go. They pay the capital expenditure on a weekly basis using M-Pesa and micro payments. So these are the kinds of innovations we can see, transformative ones in emerging markets. But after that Jugaad book came out, we realized there was a lot of interest in frugal innovation in the West, for the West. So Navi Raju and I, we looked at this and we realized that in the West, and now of course this is spread to India as well, you have the rise of a group of consumers we call prosumers. So these are not just passive recipients of products and services from companies. These are more actively involved in the economic process, and they're driving at least 3 movements. One is the sharing economy, where people like you and me can now directly trade spare assets with each other on a mobile platform. Airbnb is an example of that. The second pillar is the maker movement. And this is where now small teams of people, sometimes our students, can do things not only in software, but even in hardware that only big companies or the government could do 10 or 20 years ago. I'll talk about that. And then there's the circular economy, where companies are moving from a kind of linear approach, taking raw materials from nature, making products, selling them to consumers who then just dump them back. Instead of doing that, which is very wasteful and bad for the environment, companies are thinking of how to reduce, reuse, and recycle all the materials in their products. So these are driving a frugal economy. Let's look at the sharing economy. Now, you see that the traditional rental sector, according to PwC, is pretty small in 2013, but expected to grow very dramatically by 2025. How will it grow so fast? I mean, what's behind this rapid scaling? Well, really, it's the business model, which is fundamentally asset light. It is fundamentally frugal. So here's a quote from Brian Chesky, and this is what you can do with digital, really. This is why digital is so transformative. Brian Chesky says, we're potentially competing with the big hotel chains like Marriott. Now, if Marriott wants to add capacity, let's say, in 1 year, they want to add something like 30,000 rooms, they would have to do that physically. And that would take time, money, people, and so forth. Airbnb can create that capacity in 2 weeks because it doesn't have to build anything new. It takes what is already there and just joins the dots. So people just have to click and their assets are on the platform for others to access. Now, the maker movement, I think this is even more transformative and has huge implications for startups and for large companies. So this is where small teams, sometimes of our students, are doing amazing things. So this is a former student of mine. He was a mature student. He was doing his MBA part-time with us while he was in an academic in the computer science department here in Cambridge, responsible for student admissions, undergraduate selection of students. And he and his colleagues had noticed that fewer and fewer young people were applying to study computer science in Cambridge or in the UK. And even the ones who had applied had never opened a computer and tinkered with the hardware. They had never done any coding. So they said, what can we do about it? What if we come up with a computer that's so basic? And you see that, Raspberry Pi is holding in his hand. It's a microprocessor. The first one was about $30. They now have a $5 version. If we give that to students, they would have to tinker with it. They would have to combine it with memory devices and displays. And of course, they would have to code for it. And it would be so cheap that if they broke it, it wouldn't be a big deal. And they thought they would sell a few thousand units. They've sold several million. And now people are using these, combining them with sensors and webcams to develop other frugal Internet of Things devices. So another student of mine, Prabhu, he took the Raspberry Pi, he gave it a cladding, he branded it Co-Learner, and he loaded it with the Khan Academy. The Khan Academy is the entire US school curriculum available in video form on YouTube for free. Now, Prabhu said, well, there are lots of kids around the world, unfortunately, don't have access to the internet, and they may not have access even to a PC, but they'll often have access to a TV, so they'll be able to connect this to the TV and then access all this amazing, rich educational material. We carry around very sophisticated computers in our pockets that are networked and that have cameras and so on. This company spun out of UC Berkeley called Cellscope has made a whole range of medical devices that click into the audio jack and leverage the smartphone. So this is an otoscope here, which a mother can use to take high resolution pictures of the inner ear of her daughter and send them to a consultant somewhere else. This device is a fraction of the cost of the standalone otoscope. And of course, it enables a patient to be involved and it enables telemedicine and so on. And they've gone on to develop many other medical devices like this, like dermoscopes and so on. This 3D printer is about less than $200. And at that price, it is potentially within striking distance of households, including potentially in India. But even if you cannot afford a 3D printer like this, you can go to spaces. These are called tech shops or fab labs or make spaces. We have one here in Cambridge. We have many in India now. In these spaces, you have access to all kinds of tools, traditional tools, like lathes and so on, but also digital manufacturing tools like 3D printers, laser cutters, circuit board printers. But most importantly, you have access to a community of like-minded makers, and you can bounce your ideas off them. So these students I mentioned from Stanford with the baby warmer, they had to develop it for that course, and they didn't know how to do it. They had this idea of a blanket that the mother could use to cover the baby, but that's not enough. You need something that will keep temperature fixed for a period of time. So they went to the tech shop near Stanford in Palo Alto, and they were talking to people there, and they met someone who was a former NASA scientist, and he told them about these phase change materials, these waxy substances that you can heat either through electricity or hot water, and they will keep temperature fixed for a period of time. And this is a crucial ingredient. Without it, this product would not work. And they got that idea from the tech shop. So this is Jane Chen of Embrace, and celebrated by Obama. And it's interesting that Obama actually hosted a maker fair, a festival in the White House celebrating this kind of making. And you can see why. He says that this kind of do-it-yourself is tomorrow's made in America, a new kind of manufacturing, where it's more high value add, it's more creative, it's more sustainable. You can bring it in micro factories, into city centers, and revitalize them. And I think this has a lot of implications for India when we think about Make in India going forward. And so we updated our second book. We wrote about how this is happening not only in the West, but also in India and other emerging markets, where large companies are also tapping into this frugal innovation revolution. So we've talked a little bit about what innovation is, all the different types. We've given examples from both the West and from emerging markets like India. Now, if innovation is so great and everybody wants to do it, how come it's so difficult for people to do? Why is it that even companies that have done it once or twice, I gave the example of Sony, why did Sony fail to develop the iPod before Apple did? Well, there is a view that actually, particularly breakthrough innovations, come from entrepreneurs, from new companies, from startups, whereas the established successful companies seem to ignore or stall or fight radical innovations. And there are many examples of this from history. So Harry Warner of Warner Brothers famously said when Talking Pictures started, who the hell wants to hear actors talk? And of course, we know he proved to be wrong. Daryl Zanuck, sticking with film, he poo-pooed television. He said, oh, TV won't hold on to any market. People just get tired of looking at a plywood box. And again, we see how wrong that was. The president of Western Union had the opportunity to buy the telephone for $100,000. And he said, what use would we make of this toy? And here is the most surprising quote. This is 1977, president of Digital Equipment, one of the top computer companies at that time. In 77, he said, there is no reason for any individual to have a computer in their home. And this was the same year that Bill Gates and his friends at Microsoft and Steve Jobs and his friends in Apple had made it their mission to get a computer in every home. So there are some reasons for this. Rebecca Henderson of Harvard says it's because established companies, they underinvest in radical innovation and they become incompetent at it. Pankaj Gawawat has said there's technological inertia. If you have, successfully pioneered one technological generation, then you're slow to go to the next one. And Christensen has talked about how companies might end up listening too closely to their current customers and they miss the opportunities of new markets and new customers. So I often, when I do this session with companies, I often ask them, particularly if they're big companies, do you think you're inertial, you're slow? Do you think you're arrogant? Do you think you're incompetent? Do you think you may be stuck in the past? And when they reflect, they can see that maybe when they become big and successful, some of these things start to creep in. And it's possible that large firms, face these kinds of obstacles. So, I've, along with co-authors, spent several years now studying this in many, many sectors. And actually what we find, we've looked at pharmaceuticals, we've looked at banking, consumer appliances, and so on. We actually find that large companies may be all these things, but they also actually tend to introduce more radical innovations. And moreover, when they introduce a radical innovation, they actually are able to gain more from these innovations. They're able to commercialize them better. And this is mainly because they have resources, and resources matter for innovation. Okay, whatever you say about resources, they matter. They can help you invest and come up with new ideas and so on. Now, that said, even large firms, maybe particularly large firms, they face significant organizational challenges. So it's not about resources. Yes, they have resources, but they have organizational challenges to keep innovating over time. And here are some of them. You can appreciate why it's difficult. So innovation is a very strange beast. It involves doing new things, coming up with new ideas which may be commercialized in new ways, and those may be different from your current offerings, your current products and services, and how you are marketing them. Current offerings might involve very different skills and assets compared to new offerings. So, I said when Amazon came along, the bricks and mortar bookshops really struggled because they were having to use their existing resources and assets to sell books in stores, but they also had to create these new mindsets and assets to sell online. And that was really difficult. Also, trying something new always involves some failure and possible risk. You're trying out new things. And so being able to be successful with your current offerings and your current solutions, as well as new ones, requires ambidexterity. You need to be able to do two different things at the same time. And that is always a challenge. Okay. So this brings me to my third topic of a discussion, which is how do you address that? How do you deal with that? How can you create a culture of innovation that is able to help the company organically not only do what it is doing today, but also be preparing for the future and developing new things? So, I'll just start by asking this question. I love asking this question. A lot of people, say IBM, some say digital equipment, it wasn't any of those computer companies. It was actually a company from a different sector altogether. It was Xerox. And interestingly, Xerox in the 1970s in their Palo Alto Research Center in California, they invented all the things that we now use and go into the so-called paperless office. Laser copier, PC, printer, laptop, even word processing, all these things, and email. They invented the paperless office. And as proof, here's the laser printer. Now, it's a bit bigger than the one we use today, but you get the idea. But look at this. This was the PC that they came up with in 1973. If you look at the keyboard, the mouse, and the interface, it's very similar to PCs that we use to this day, the graphical user interface and all that. This is a bit different. This is the hard drive. That's become much smaller. And this, of course, is the storage. That has become much smaller. We now have, these memory sticks and so on, which hold much more memory than those. But the essence of that computer was invented by Xerox in 1973. It was so intuitive that kids could use it, as you see here, playing games on it. And yet, by the 1980s, this was history for Xerox. Xerox does not have its brand on any of those inventions. And the question is why? How can a company get so far with inventing things, revolutionary things, and then fail to commercialize them? So my co-authors and I decided to study this to understand, what are the challenges that these large companies face. And so we did this study, and we wanted to really look across countries because we thought maybe there's something about the country, maybe there's something about the company. And of course, there's a huge literature on why some countries are more innovative than others. There are lots of different fields that study this. Sociologists like Max Weber had a theory about religion and how, Protestant ethic in Northern European countries made them more suited to capitalist enterprise and innovation relative to other like Catholic cultures in Europe. Social psychologists like Hofstadter say, no, it's actually about culture, not religion, your national culture. Some cultures are very hierarchical and that comes in the way of innovation. Others are more individualistic, that helps with innovation. Geographers say it's all about how far you are from the equator. The further you are from the equator, the better. Because the reason being, when you're in a very cold place, you have to think about the future in order to survive. And that thinking about the future is at the heart of innovation. Whereas when you live in the tropics, nature provides from day to day. You don't really have to think too far into the future. Legal scholars have talked about the importance of IP. It's all about intellectual property protection. And they argue that, for instance, China, which was the most advanced economy in the 17th century, even 18th century, didn't have the Industrial Revolution because there was no benefit to private enterprise and creativity. Everything belonged to the emperor. Whereas in Europe, through the Renaissance and so on, individual artists and inventors could capture the returns to their creativity. And that created a huge incentive for people to innovate from the grassroots. Economists say it's all about spending, how much you spend on R&D at a national level or in a company. Whereas if you ask business school people like myself, we think it's what happens inside the organization. And so we wanted to really pit all these different theories against each other to see what really mattered. And we did a very large survey. It's still the largest survey of its kind, the largest study of its kind. We sent out 4,000 surveys to companies in 17 countries, both the advanced economies, but also emerging markets like China and India. We looked at only manufacturing, but we looked at different sizes of companies, and we sent it to people, who were responsible for innovation in the company. And so we had a survey that we sent out. We also had secondary data that we is in our sample, and we also had country level data. And this is the upshot. I'm cutting short on the paper, but basically what we found was that what drives innovation across countries is really what's happening inside the organization and what cultural traits the company has. We found that the firm's culture was the biggest driver of radical innovation in these companies, followed by R&D spending. So spending, as I said earlier, resources matter, but culture matters much more. And this is what we mean by culture. So these are the items in our survey that really picked up the differences between the companies that were most innovative and the ones that were not. So let me go through these. And first, there were 3 attitudes that mattered a lot. First, the most innovative companies not only spent time thinking about the present, they also thought about the future. There was some time and resource devoted to thinking about new opportunities, new challenges, and so on. Now, if you think about it, companies that do that are more likely to come up with new prototypes, new solutions, new products and services, new processes. But they also then have to be willing to replace their current products and processes with these new ones. And so that was the second attitude. A willingness to cannibalize some of your existing success is important in order to keep innovating. Because if your current success is too much of a holy cow and you will not touch it, then you will not move on and you will not come up with new ideas. And then, of course, if you're going to cannibalize current products with new ideas, which are risky, then that requires being willing to take some risk, because it's very likely that you're betting on something new and uncertain against something that is proven, and that's risky and requires willingness to take risk. Now, how do you support those attitudes? We found out 3 practices that really mattered a lot. One is having innovation champions throughout the firm. So Mr. Shivakumar was saying, who owns innovation? Well, we found that innovation needs to be owned by everyone in the company. It's not just a top management thing. People at the grassroots, people at the coalface, they need to have some empowerment, because they are often encountering new ideas coming through customers, coming through suppliers, coming through competitors, and they have ideas that you should tap into. So very innovative companies empower people at different levels in the company to either come up with ideas or take them forward in some way. Second practice that's important is incentives. Now, this is a really important and tricky one. So obviously, if people try something new and they're successful, you have to reward them. And it doesn't have to be financial. Very often, it can just be recognition. And in fact, if you have too many financial incentives, that could crowd out these kind of social behaviors. But what do you do about failure? That's a really tricky one. Because typically, especially large companies, which are very bureaucratic, failure is frowned upon, failure is stigmatized, and therefore, people try to play it safe. And therefore, they will not try out new ideas, particularly if they're a bit risky. So if you want to encourage innovation, you have to find a way to de-risk failure. You have to give people a safe space. You have to give them some time in which they can experiment, they can fail fast and cheap and all that, and then they can learn and the organization can move on. Okay, so that's a key point. And the final one, this is a way to break the kind of inertia that you might see in large organizations that are slow to move and respond to pressures or opportunities. So one way large companies do that is they create what we call internal markets. So they create divisions that have some level of competition between each other. So if somebody comes up with a new idea in the firm and they go to one division and that division says no for whatever reason, then they can go to another division that might want to compete with the other division in order to be innovative. So this was the heart of our paper and what we found. And actually, a lot of this links back to the Xerox story. So what happened at Xerox? Well, they did some things right. So for instance, they had an innovation champion, and actually it was the leader, the CEO in the late 60s, visionary leader. He and the board asked the question, we're making copy machines. Yeah, we're very successful, but it depends, or it assumes that people will be using paper, going forward. But what if companies suddenly realize that, there's computers and so on, and they don't need paper? And what if somebody comes up with a paperless office? What's that going to do to our business? So instead of waiting for somebody to do that, why don't we do it ourselves? Let's create the office of the future, the paperless office. So that was the vision, came from the top. They had this champion. And then they set up the Palo Alto Research Center, as I said, and the top leadership, hired some of the best computer scientists at that time in the early 70s. They gave them time, money, space, all the things I was talking about to experiment, to really think about the future and come up with this paperless office of the future. So they did some things right. They had this future focus. They had an innovation champion. They were giving some of their people this opportunity to try out new ideas. Then some things went wrong. First, the innovation champion himself died, in this case, Wilson. So they lost that champion. And this is the drawback of having the champion only from the top. A totally top-down approach can be dangerous. This is also what many people said, about Apple and Steve Jobs. Then this is something that happens a lot in big companies. And Sony is another example of this, and Kodak and lots of other companies have this problem. And Xerox had the same problem. They had two silos. They had the scientists who were in Palo Alto, who were developing the office of the future, the paperless office, all these amazing inventions I told you. And 3,000 miles away in the East Coast in headquarters, they had the managers, including the sales managers, who were selling copy machines. So, the left hand and the right hand were not talking to each other. And this is what I was saying about being ambidextrous. The sales managers were very successful selling copy machines, and there were markets that were just roaring at that time in Japan and so on. So they were, only thinking about copy machines. The scientists, meanwhile, were thinking about something that would make copy machines obsolete. And when the scientists came up with all these amazing things like the laser copier and the PC and all this kind of stuff, and they presented it 5 years later to the managers, what do you think happened? The managers, first response was fear. Oh my God, what is this new thing is going to replace what, our bread and butter, what's making our revenues and all this kind of stuff. The first response was fear. Some of them also had like bewilderment, like they had not thought about what is the wealth, what's the upside of the electronic office. They had not been thinking about how they would sell it, who they would sell it to, what the margins would be, all those kinds of things. And the consequence, you won't believe it, is that the managers actually refused, the main part of the organization refused to commercialize any of these things. And in fact, Palo Alto Research Center had some famous visitors. Steve Jobs visited often, so did Bill Gates. And therefore, it's no surprise that Windows looks a lot like the graphical user interface that Xerox developed. And of course, the Mac looks almost identically like the Alto. So the world benefited, and so did Apple and Microsoft, but not Xerox. And so I conclude this section by saying that, yes, inputs matter, resources are important. That's why large firms can keep innovating and stay innovative over time. However, resources alone are not enough. What is much more important is creating a culture of innovation. And that's about having the right attitudes and practices. You can spend a lot of money, you can throw a lot of money at things, you can have a lot of money, and you could still not be innovative. You could have less money like Apple. So Sony is the example of the company which had a lot of money, didn't come up with the iPod. Apple didn't at that time have a lot of money, but they had this insanely good product and they really focused on it. Now, I'll just end with some thoughts on your role as leaders in fostering innovation. So what role can you play in fostering these attitudes and practices? And I'll talk specifically about, the CEO, but anyone on the top team. Now, we know that, the CEO is very important in driving innovation. You might argue that that is, the main role of a CEO is to think about the future and drive innovation in the company. Of course, other people can have a role in this as well, including the CFO. I remember presenting this at Nokia headquarters some years ago. And, when I showed this, they started laughing because their next CEO was their current CFO. And so maybe that was some of the problems that Nokia faced. At any rate, now the CEO matters. We know the top person matters. However, if you only rely on the top person, there could be problems because the top person, no matter how smart they are, they could get it wrong. So this is a quote from An Wang, who was very successful with the word processor and created Wang Labs. So he was innovative when it came to the word processor. But then when the PC started to come around, he completely dismissed it. He said, oh, the PC is the stupidest thing I ever heard of. And maybe that's why you haven't heard of An Wang. I quoted Ken Olsen earlier of digital equipment. In 1977, he said, there's no reason anyone would want a computer in their home. And this is a very smart guy. He had a PhD from MIT. Obviously, digital equipment was a very successful company at that time. but he missed out on this important development. And actually, he went even further. He was very dictatorial about it. He actually told employees that they should not use this word, home computer or personal computer, in the company. And of course, this digital equipment is no longer, and in fact, it didn't last very long into the 80s. Now, what's going on here? I'm going to go back to future focus, that attitude I mentioned at the start. Now, it's not that these CEOs I've just mentioned are not capable of thinking. Of course, they are thinking a lot about lots of things, but it's the emphasis. And my feeling and my fear is that often when you rise in the organization, really you should be thinking more about the future, but unfortunately, you get bogged down in the present. You get bogged down with current customers and competitors. You're firefighting. You're thinking about too short-term things and not enough about the future. Obviously, you have to attend to current things as well, but you should not let them drown out, thinking about the future and giving yourself opportunities to think about the future. And in fact, this is a common problem with senior management. And Prahlad and Hamel long ago pointed this out. Senior management, they said, is devoting less than 3% of its energy to building a corporate perspective of the future. So, this is not a current problem, it's an endemic problem. And the question is, how can you find ways to do your business as usual, to think about current issues, but also give yourself some space and time to think about the future? Bill Gates, when he was CEO at Microsoft, did this systematically. He had something called Think Week, which was a week every 6 months. He would take a week off. He would go to a cabin in the mountains. He would shut himself up with books and articles and memos, and he would think really about what's the next big challenge, what should we be doing next. And then, at the end of the week, he would come down a bit like Moses from the mountain, and he would send a memo to people in the organization. Here is a memo he sent, an email he sent in May 1995, titled Internet Tidal Wave. And basically he had realized that Microsoft had been developing products for PCs and not the internet. And the internet was the big thing that was happening, and communications networks and so on. And they needed software for the internet. And that's out of this memo basically came Internet Explorer, and it killed Netscape. It just completely took on the competition of Netscape and won. So I'll just wrap up by saying this is what we've talked about. We've looked at a definition of innovation, the different types of innovation, how it might differ in a very affluent society from an emerging market. We've looked at how you can now do more with less using all kinds of resources. And in fact, young people are doing that. Startups are doing it. How can large companies join? Then we talked about the challenges of innovation. Everybody wants to innovate, yet it's difficult to do that. Why? Why do successful companies that have innovated many times fail to do it again and again and again? Sony being an example, they could have done iPod and they didn't. And, there's something about, yes, resources matter and big firms have resources, but organizationally, when you become big and you're successful, you have this challenge balancing your current successful products with your new uncertain products. And you're either not thinking enough about the future, or you're not willing to cannibalize current products with your new ideas. So this brings in this notion of a culture of innovation. How can you foster attitudes and practices that are deep within the organization so that the organization organically finds a way to balance some of these paradoxes, is organically able to deal with being successful with current products, but also think about the future, come up with new ideas, test them, maybe fail, learn from them, and keep moving on. And in the end, I talked about your role as leaders, the importance of thinking about the future, not getting bogged down in the present situation, taking time out like Bill Gates did from time to time to really clear your head, look above the parapet, think about the next big opportunities, reflect, maybe do that with other people in your top team, including people from other parts of the organization. Do this periodically. So, takeaways, we all know innovation is critical. It's a do or die thing, but it isn't easy. Everyone wants to do it, but it's hard to do. And at the heart of doing it is creating and fostering a culture of innovation. So your role, I'll just leave you with this, is you have to be visionaries. That is, while dealing with the day-to-day, you also have to think about the future. You have to develop a vision for the future. You have to be willing to take risk. You have to experiment and empower others to experiment. And you have to be architects, because innovation cannot and should not be done just at the top. It has to involve the whole organization. You have to take others with you. So you have to be architects. You have to create these communities within your organization, involving people at different levels, and also involving people from outside the company. And finally, you have to be champions, and you have to create champions in your company for new ideas, whether they're technical, commercial, or organizational. And if you do all that, you'll be innovative, and your people and the people of India and your markets will thank you for innovating, and I will thank you for innovating too. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Prof, for that. So there are a bunch of questions streaming in. So I'll just pick the question. So I will not ask you anything from my end. So the first question is, or I'm just picking it, was the Tata Nano project a failed attempt at frugal innovation?
Okay, that's a great question. And, I do give the example of the Nano as an example of Indian jugaad by a large company. And yes, I would say that it failed in terms of its sales, in terms of the vision for it to create a people's car that would really, replicate the success that the Maruti had. And it failed to do that. But I think it showed that a large company could attempt to do something as bold as that. It showed us some of the principles that would be required to do it. And it showed us that how difficult it is to be successful with a frugal innovation. Even if you are from an emerging market, you have been in that market for a long time, and you think you understand the market. And we know, each of us probably has our own example of why the Tata Nano failed. But in my mind, there are so many different things. One is probably thinking not enough about the market and the consumer, and thinking more about the product and the process. The product and process, I think, is just fine, but the positioning was wrong. I remember reading so many articles calling it the world's cheapest car. And of course, low-income people are aspirational. They don't want the cheapest thing in the world. They want an affordable thing, but they want a cool aspirational thing. And I think then, later the Nano tried to reposition as an aspirational car and so on. Then there was some real practical things, like where do you sell it? If you sell it in a car dealership, then it's going to be by definition the bottom of the rung. It won't be aspirational. But if you sell it in a two-wheeler dealership, then it will be aspirational. But that's harder to do. And this is a good example of current success in cars, making it hard for you to move into a different sector almost. I mean, a different category. And then, things like, the culture of how you're selling this in dealerships. And if you're selling to people who typically don't have, bank accounts or don't have easy access to loans, then you have to get into financing. So people may have, like farmers may have land as collateral, but it may not be easy for them to get loans to buy cars. And also the dealer networks may not be suited to them. So, a lot of these kinds of practical questions become really challenging, even for a large successful company that's operated in that market. So I think it was not as successful as they had hoped, as many thought it would be, but it has told us many things, and we have learned a lot from that. And probably Tatas have also learned a lot from that.
Okay, another question, Prof, is that what key organization variables, such as reward systems or communication systems, affect the performance of the frugal innovation process?
Yeah, so, I think it's not just about frugal innovation, it's about innovation more broadly. I would say incentives are very important, as I said, both incentives and communication. I'll take incentives first. And as I said, you have to reward people who try out new things and succeed, obviously. And that's a no-brainer, right? I mean, if somebody has tried out something new and it's successful, then obviously you have to reward it, you have to acknowledge it. But the interesting thing is, I've done sessions on a culture of innovation with top managers from all kinds of companies, from Roche, the pharmaceutical company, to Nokia, I mentioned, I went to Finland, ING Bank, BT, British Telecom, Vodafone. And, it's very interesting that when you do it, I give them some of the questions we asked in our survey and ask them to rate themselves. And it's interesting how some of these very large companies, including pharmaceutical companies, they score themselves very low on the incentives. And, they, for instance, a pharmaceutical companies say that the startups, biotech startups particularly, do so much better at incentivizing innovation, creativity, and success and experimentation. And actually, some of the largest companies, pharma companies, have tried to mimic that aspect of startups. So even recognizing success in some way, it doesn't have to be financial, just acknowledgement and so on can be very powerful. As I said, then the question is how you manage failure. And this is really tricky for companies, because they generally frown on failure for good reasons. But if you do that, then of course you encourage a kind of very bureaucratic, safe kind of approach to life, and people will avoid experimentation. That means they won't be trying out new things, and that means you won't have new products and services, and you won't learn. This is where the nano, as I was saying, at least I hope Tata Motors and Tatas have learned from some of the problems that they had with really commercializing the nano. So that's the challenge. Now, you have this issue of, I'll just give an example of Ben and Jerry's. What do you do with failed projects? So, sometimes you just have to move on. And actually, sometimes you have to move on even from successful projects. So Ben and Jerry's, they'll try out new ice cream, sometimes with really weird flavors. And if it doesn't work, they actually have a funeral, or they used to when they were a smaller company. They would have a funeral for the failed flavor. They would all congregate, go to their backyard and bury it. And that had a kind of cathartic effect. Like, okay, we moved on. We learned something from it. This is a natural part of what happens in a business. You try, you fail, you bury it and you move on. You learn something from it. So different companies have different rituals. Speaking of the Tatas, I think they even have an annual award for best failure. So you can, recognize that. And I think that leads to communication, because really then it's the leadership, all the way down, that communicates that there is there are safe spaces for people at different levels to come up with new ideas, sometimes to try those new ideas, experiment, fail, and learn from them, and not stigmatize this. So communication, of course, goes hand in hand with that. How you can celebrate victories, how you can mourn failures but learn from the failures, how you can destigmatize failed experiments.
Yeah. So next question, you talked of commercial exploitation as being something important in the process of innovation. Sometimes insanely great products, two of them, which I'll give you, the Concorde and Iridium. They're absolutely great products, but both were shelved. Any lessons from that?
So, many lessons, insanely good products, may be great from a design perspective. They may be great even, from a technological perspective. They may be really breakthroughs. But in the end, for something to be commercially successful, it's the customer who decides. And it's not always clear who the customer is. Sometimes it's the end user, sometimes it's the intermediary, the company, it could be B2B, B2C. It could be the government, it could be other organizations. So that's what makes commercialization, even of the best technical ideas, something that looks and sounds great on paper, that looks beautiful, it doesn't grab the customer. And it's not just about grabbing the customer. Something might look beautiful to the customer, but then it still has to be available to the customer. It has to be affordable. And we know this particularly, going back to another example of the Tata, problems, not just with the Nano. Even if people found it beautiful, then there were these problems of affordability in terms of how they do the financing, where they would access it, all this kind of stuff. But even with the Tata Swatch, with the water filter, which was, $10, I think, to pure it, which was about $20, Unilever, they had challenges with the distribution. So even though Tata is an older Indian company than Unilever, Hindustan Unilever, Unilever had the links into all the Kirana shops and so on, which could distribute their water filter, whereas the Swatch couldn't. So, commercialization is about so many different things. It's about the distribution, affordability, accessibility, acceptability in that context, in that market. And this is where the challenge is particularly large. Now, you have other insanely good products that have done insanely well. And I think it's because in some way they put the customer first. Now, of course, you can always say this after the fact, but this is the genius, I think, of Steve Jobs, particularly in that last 10 years when he was in Apple. I think had learned all his lessons, many failures along the way. And he had learned the importance of technology and design and all this, but he had learned most of all that what matters is the customer's view of something. You may think that your product is great, but if the customer doesn't, you are wrong. It's the customer's right. And so he made that the heart of his intense, insanely good products. And starting with the iPod, but we saw that with the iPhone, and we saw it with the iPad. The idea that how can we make the customer experience so amazing that it looks like magic. So when you're first able to just download and buy like one song at less than $1, and then just store it on something that's so cool, and you just have these earphones and you carry it around, much better than a Walkman or Discman. And that iTunes bit, that you could have access to songs at like a one song at a time. That's extraordinary. And of course the interactivity of it, and how the flywheel, all that's so intuitive. And of course all that went into the iPhone as well, that very intuitive interface. So when he first presented that blank screen to people, they thought, this is magic. How can you do, when they were used to Blackberries with all those little buttons? So putting the customer first, and what would really look like magic to the customer, then the products sell themselves. And of course you still have to think about distribution and all those kinds of things, but if you make the customer insanely crazy about your product, everything follows.
There's a question. What do you think is the next big thing coming up in the next couple of years in any field? Any thoughts?
Okay, so it's a big question. And actually, our PR person in our business school just asked me to write a couple of short pieces for Poets and Quants, which is a website directed at MBA students. And so what I wrote about, two things. Now, this is a personal view, of course. One is digital education. Now, that's been happening for a while, but it's now become clear to me, particularly with COVID, just how huge this is going to be. And it goes to the heart of what I do and many of my colleagues do, which is teaching in a university. So for hundreds of years, you had this idea that, a university is a physical place, and people, have to come there, wherever they are from. If you want to get a good education, you have to leave your home, travel hundreds of miles, pay lots of money, stop working, and go and spend 1, 2, 3, 4 years studying in some remote place. And yes, there are some great benefits. I mean, living in Cambridge is a wonderful place for a student to come, especially as an undergraduate. There are beautiful buildings, there are great facilities, there's all this tradition. You get to see people and meet people and talk to people. So yeah, you may still have that. But what happens after they get their first degree? And then they go back to their country, they're working, and what they've learned in those 4 years is already obsolete. Okay, the space is so good. Or even if they have done an MBA and they go back, and already their work is what they've studied in the MBA is obsolete in a couple of years, or at least there are new things to study. They can't give up their jobs now. They're earning, they have families. They can't go back to the university to do another, even a 6-month course or a 1-week course or a 2-week course. So now we have, amazing opportunities to keep learning throughout your life. This is an example of that, what we are doing now, what CII has done with this strategy seminar. And there's so many such things that people like me and universities where I work are going to have to think about. How can we think about the changing nature of work, and therefore the changing nature of education, and how can we use innovation to really reach people who we otherwise could not reach in a convenient, affordable, quality way? So that was one. The other one I gave was in manufacturing and offshoring. So I'm linking manufacturing with supply chains here. And I think, we've been, again, moving towards away from offshoring, particularly, to one place like China, to what's been called reshoring. So moving at least some parts of your manufacturing closer to home, closer to customers. And there are many reasons for this. One is, of course, the economics of it are starting to change. So there was a time when, of course, labor costs in China were very low. That's changed. So the labor equation has changed. Then, of course, the geopolitics have changed. As we know, many countries now are worried about having all their assets or important manufacturing assets in China for various reasons, including the COVID crisis. And then, of course, environmentally, the cost of shipping things from China to your markets all over the world, that's a challenge. And then also, importantly, because you need to keep up with customers, the closer you are to customers, the faster you can respond to changing customer preferences. So all these things, I think, are driving a move away from offshoring towards reshoring. But there's another big driver, and that's what I referred to in my talk when I was talking about digital manufacturing and the maker move. where now you have these spaces, these micro factories, which are often community spaces, which you can access in your community. And by the way, there's an amazing network in India of maker spaces. There was something like 42 that formed a network almost overnight called the M19 Collective in March, when the lockdown started to happen. And they, in a very short period of time, were sharing designs with each other online for all this PPE, protective equipment of frontline workers like visors, and they were making them locally for local consumption. So I think we now have this ecosystem, global ecosystem of local sort of micro factories, shall we say, where you can create not just software but hardware. You can, through open source often, using these cheap computers, these microprocessors, cheap sensors, cheap webcams, all these kinds of things, to create Internet of Things devices that can be used in the home or in the smart office, or even to address things like pollution and so on. You can make them in a city for a city. In fact, this is what's happening in Barcelona. They use the Fab Lab network that they have there to make products for local consumption, but where the design can then be sent to another factory in another city where they can make the same product. Like, for instance, they make something called a Smart Citizen Kit, which is a device that will read air pollution and then collect all this information from lots of people and process it. So I think this phenomenon of make spaces and this maker movement is going to drive a kind of revolution where in manufacturing, and a kind of more clean manufacturing, where you can have micro factories even in city centers. And then what happens is that you can develop things there for local consumption. So you may not make the whole car, obviously, in a micro factory, but you can make spare parts for people in that city. So those are some of my predictions.
So let me ask you another question. What do you see as the difference between frugal innovation and Prahlad's bottom of the pyramid approach?
Oh, great question. I mean, obviously, our whole area is inspired by Prahlad. He was the pioneer in this area, actually drawing our attention to this very large, untapped market opportunity at the base of the pyramid, something like 4 billion people, more than half the world's population around the world, who live in the informal economy, who do have some disposable income. But of course, if you're going to really reach them, you have to have highly affordable products, which means your margins are razor thin, but the volumes would make it profitable. So that basic insight was highly, of course, influential. It influenced many people, including myself and my co-authors. And then I suppose what we tried to do was to take it to the next step. And because my area is innovation, we started to look at, if you're going to really tap into that base of the pyramid market opportunity, what does it mean for how you should innovate? And really, we realized that the innovation process has to change for, large Western companies going to emerging markets, but also for large domestic companies in emerging markets. You can't just focus on the top of the pyramid. Of course, that's a very large number in a country like India, but because there's a lot of competition there, so that's a kind of red ocean. The blue ocean is below that. The aspirants, people who are in urban slums or in smaller towns, richer farmers, and they're the ones that you really have an opportunity to this blue ocean to really grow with as the country gets richer. But you can't just take your products and services designed for the top of the pyramid, just de-feature them and drop the price a bit and expect that they will be accepted by people lower down in the pyramid. So you have to really start from scratch, and that is really what we looked at in our books. Really, how do you do that? Like, how do you first of all get that deep customer insight into the nature of the problem, their context, how do they earn and spend money, how do you make things affordable, how do you make them accessible, the distribution element, the last mile problem, and then think about, okay, what does that mean for the innovation process? How do you go about being radically affordable? And one of the things we realized is the Jugaad approach. So if you see Chinese and Indian companies, let's say medical device companies, unlike GE and Philips, GE and Philips, if they want to make a new ECG machine, like the famous Mac 100 device that was made in Bangalore, new ECG machines specifically for emerging markets, for rural markets, where the doctor would go from the city to the countryside, the ECG machine couldn't be some massive, expensive thing. It would have to be a portable device that would fit in a doctor's bag and, of course, run on batteries and so on. So they knew that. But then they went one step further and they said, okay, let's do it like our Indian and Chinese competitors. Let's do jugaad. In fact, that's how I learned that large multinationals were taking this seriously. And they said that what this meant for them was, instead of doing it the way they would typically do it in their own R&D center with their R&D team, big budget, start from scratch, do everything themselves, own the IP. That would be expensive and take time. They would work backwards from the spec and take off-the-shelf components, exactly like their Chinese manufacturers were doing. So they said, okay, if we need a keypad, telephones have keypads, let's use that component. Or we need a printer, let's use bus ticket printers and even the paper, that's cheaper. So take off-the-shelf components, what is already there, cut and paste them, join the dots, use a quality control standard, and you have a product faster, better, cheaper. And that's the essence, I think, of what we identified as this jugaad approach to innovation, or frugal innovation. We see that with M-Pesa as well. The Vodafone product I mentioned that was introduced in Kenya, and now you have in many different countries. They basically did the same thing. They said, what do people already have? What's already there? People have mobile phones, even remote people. They are used to texting. In fact, they noticed that people in Kenya were already texting minutes to one another as a form of currency. So they ran with that idea. So they can text money as a kind of currency. They have mobile phones and texting, and then they have local kirana shops, which can be the agent to cash the money. So they have all the elements there. They just join the dots and create a system. So I think that's what we have contributed in a way, building on Prahlad's work on the base of the pyramid.
Okay, there's another question here which says, as an FMCG major, our premiumized luxury categories have been hit hard by the pandemic and discretionary spends have reduced. How do we go frugal in a category which inherently requires large investments?
Okay, that's a great question, really tricky one. And obviously, I think my response is going to be somewhat incomplete here. But one of the things we realized, and this was also kind of major kind of revelation, there were these periods when talking to people, we suddenly had these revelations when we were researching the two books that we wrote. And this goes back to a meeting we had with a very senior person at Tata Motors, and we asked them a similar question because they had premium brands. They had a Jaguar Land Rover at that time, premium brands, and then they also had the Nano. And we said, how does frugal innovation sit in a company that has luxury brands? Can you apply it to luxury brands? And this very senior person said, absolutely. You apply that principle, those principles that you learned of process on the process side, okay, on the supply side, on the manufacturing side, on the operation side. You apply that frugal mindset to the making of the car, even if it's a Jaguar Land Rover. So you get economize, and that reduces your cost, but you could still have a luxury product and have margins. And in fact, that increases your margins. That stuck with me, that frugal is not only about making something affordable to the customer. Of course, that's often the case. And if you want to make it affordable to the customer, you have to have a frugal approach to R&D and innovation. But you could have a frugal approach to R&D and innovation and still produce something at the high end. Now, the question is, how do you keep the margins high if people's discretionary spends have gone down? So that, I think, is a very delicate one because, the temptation or the obvious thing to do would be to drop your margins, to drop your prices, but you have to be very careful when you have a luxury brand about doing that. So maybe you have to do some experiments to see what's the price elasticity and how much should you drop. So again, I think frugal approach means trying out experiments. That's another thing that I feel is very much a part of the frugal approach. And you don't try experiments with your whole market, obviously. That would be too risky. So you take test markets and you try out little tests, with the test market, and you see what the results are. And this is where digital has become very powerful. So whenever you have a website and you're selling something digitally, that's a great opportunity to do very rigorous experiments where you can test all kinds of things, including minor changes in price and how that would affect elasticity, how that would affect demand, and so on. And you can do this very rigorously without it having a very damaging effect. So you can do A/B testing and things like that on limited markets on a few customers, but they could be real customers. So I would say maybe things like that. I would shy away from large investments, large new projects, unless you have a way of first testing them out. And that is really the frugal approach. And you can absolutely apply it even in luxury and luxury.
Okay. The next question, you said some of the things of innovation were distance from the equator, the ability to commercialize something. You gave the example of China. And then finally, you talked about cultural traits, which is what's the culture in the organization. So whether it's a local Indian company or a multinational organization, it's full of Indians anyway. Okay. So is Indianness and the culture of India really good for innovation?
That's a great question. So actually, we in that study which I mentioned to you, we only looked at companies that were from that country. We didn't look at multinationals in that country. So, we in the India part of our sample, we would have companies like Tata Motors, for instance, or Titan watches. In the UK sample, we would have Rolls-Royce. Okay. Now, we realized that that's okay for the first study, because then we could really look at the national culture and the organizational culture. But, it simplified our study. But if we really want to compare the two, we should do what you're proposing. We should actually look at multinationals that are operating in different countries and see, that way we would be able to tease out the effect of the country versus the company. We would really be able to tease that out. And that's what we wanted to do next. But it proved too hard to do. It was already very hard to do what we had done. So we kind of gave up on that. But that's really what we should do, because then you would be able to see, if you have a company like, say, a multinational like GE, how innovative is GE in India relative to GE in China, relative to GE in the US. And if you see differences, then those differences are because of the national culture more than the company culture. That said, my feeling is that we overemphasize country culture over organizational culture. I think organizational culture matters much more, because in a country, you have a distribution of people, on any cultural attribute. You may have some people who are more individualistic, some people are more collectivistic, all these kinds of things. There is a distribution. Now, the organizations that value a certain type of person will hire those people. And so you will have, the most innovative people in that country in your company if you value innovation. So I really think that organization matters more than the country culture. But that puts even more pressure on coming up with the right organizational culture. And why culture is important is because it's so difficult to actually create and therefore mimic. It's not something that can be done overnight. We can't just look at Apple and just try and study Apple and say, okay, we'll become exactly like Apple. It'll take you a very long time to do that, because, it's their particular history and so on. So culture is one of those tricky things. It's very tricky. It's something that when you see, you know what you mean. You can even codify it, but how do you replicate it? That's really challenging.
Yeah, the next question I have is, a lot of the work on innovation talks invariably about product innovation. But if you look at the markets now, the bigger innovation and the needed innovation is actually in services. So how would you look at service innovation compared to product innovation? And in services, frugal might not necessarily be the best.
That's a great point. Now the thing is, I get this question all the time. I get this question from CEOs, top managers, from our students, from our undergraduates. And actually, having thought about it, I really feel that that's almost an artificial distinction now. That distinction, that very clear distinction between a hardcore physical thing and a service, a convenience, is breaking down, because they're integrated. Every innovation has some physical component and it has a service component. Let's take the iPhone. The iPhone, obviously, or whatever smartphone, it's a physical product, but there are services involved in the use of this product. So they integrate it inextricably. So if you're a financial service offering, an app which will help you take care of your services, your finances, it's no longer taking place in a physical branch where you have branch managers and tellers, at least less and less so. A lot of it is happening on the device. So you have to think about how the service fits with the product, and it's suited to the Android phone or to the iPhone and so on. A lot of hardcore services like education. I was just giving you an example. What is more service than education? It's a performance. You have to go and stand in front of the students and you have to perform. You have to write on the board, you have to ask questions, you have to have discussion, you have to have a case, you have an exam, they have to write the answers, they do a project, whatever. It's service. But increasingly we are realizing there's a digital technology behind it that's very important. Whether even in the classroom, if they're there face to face, there are digital technologies involved. If they are even full-time students, you have a virtual learning environment where you put a lot of the material. And then particularly if they're distance learners, then you have a physical technology to deal with at both ends. So, I think that distinction is breaking down. And actually all these attitudes and practices we are talking about, thinking about the future, being willing to cannibalize, taking risk, having champions, it applies to products and services. And actually you should think about the offering to the customer. And again, look at it from the customer's perspective. Does the customer care if it's a product or a service? What they care about is solving my problem. And so if you take that customer perspective, I think again, that divide breaks down. But absolutely, we should be thinking about all aspects, not just the tangible physical aspects, but also the intangible convenience aspects and so on.
Fantastic. Any last parting thoughts, Prof, before you close?
Thanks, Mr. Shivakumar. So first of all, let me just say it's been a great pleasure to do this, to see you again, to talk to you, to have this opportunity to present some of my work to the CII members on this forum. The questions have been brilliant. And I'm actually looking at the chat. I see there are so many questions. I would love to see all the questions. I see questions about Kaizen, lean manufacturing, amazing questions. So I'm very inspired to have this interaction. I would be delighted to stay in touch and follow up. Even though I left India many years ago, you never leave India. You care about it. I care about it. I return whenever I can, and I really care about Indian business. I think this is a very crucial time for Indian business. We have so many opportunities to really, really excel and shine. I know the pandemic has been a big kind of jhatka for us, but I have no doubt that Indian business will bounce back. We have such great talent, such amazing management experience exemplified by people like yourself. We have some of the best management thinkers in the world. You mentioned C.K. Prahlad. I've seen some of the other speakers. I mean, there are so many Indians thinking about business, and we should tap into all that talent and really make the most of what we have as a country. So those are my thoughts. I'm getting quite sentimental
Fantastic.
now.
Thank you very much, Professor Prabhu. All the very best as you launch your next book and whatever you do next in the field of academics. Thank you very much.